Well, hello. So many choices at 2 o'clock. I am so pleased to have you here, and I'm so excited to share my book with you. And what an honor to be invited to be part of this festival. We've got a lot to cover in a short period of time, and they said at 45 minutes they shut the mic off, so I will stick to my time. But I consider myself to be one of the luckiest women in the world. I had the opportunity of a lifetime to work right outside Ronald Reagan's office door and serve this incredible man for 10 years of my life post-presidency. I never ever imagined I would write a book about him. When you're the executive assistant, you have that position of proximity, and I just frankly didn't know whether it would ever be appropriate to write a book about my experiences. But I was speaking at a conference a few years ago, and a man came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, you have to write a book about your story." And I said, "Oh, I don't think I would. I'm not sure how I feel about that." And he said something to me that completely changed my perspective about it. He said, if there was a woman who sat outside Abraham Lincoln's office door every day for 10 years, don't you think we would want to know what she saw, what she learned, what she observed? And don't you think she would owe it to history to tell us? I still wasn't going to write a book, but through a crazy set of circumstances a few years ago, I was approached by Hachette Books out of New York to tell my story in book form. You may know there's about 1,000 books about Ronald Reagan out there, and so I was a little intimidated thinking, how on earth do I step into that very saturated space? And yet I knew that I saw him in such a different way because I had the beauty of those post-presidency years when the cameras weren't rolling, when he thought nobody was watching. I was always watching. And so in my book are the stories of what I learned and saw. You know, as an executive assistant, you're the person who's always behind the scenes and in the background. And so at first it was very uncomfortable to tell my story alongside his. And in fact, when I sent my first writing sample to my publisher, he called me right away and he said, "Peggy, do you know what a memoir is?" And I said, "I think so." And he said, "It means you actually have to be a character in your own story." And he told me something which really framed the book for me. And he said, not everybody can relate to being president of the United States, but everybody can relate to a part of your story. So tell your story alongside his. Don't be an interruption to the story. Be the very vehicle by which they get to see him in the way you saw him. And so I hope in the pages of my book that you will find your own story alongside mine. We all remember stepping into a space when you're young and green, and maybe it's your first job, and wondering if you'll ever fit in, feeling like it's far too big and foreign for you, and you don't know if you'll ever make a contribution. And then you find your footing, and you realize, I do belong here. I do have a place here. I can be a valued contributor in a space that seemed far too intimidating at first. And then we know that life changes. It throws us all a curveball. We never know what form it's going to come or when it's going to come, but we can guarantee that it will come. And so how do you hit those curveballs when they come? And Ronald Reagan certainly was thrown one in his post-presidency years with his diagnosis of Alzheimer's. How did he hit that curveball? And how did I observe and learn and forever be changed and impacted by the lessons I saw? So my goal in the book was to be revealing. It's not worth telling a story unless you tell something new, but also ultimately respectful. And so everybody has their own ideas about Ronald Reagan. It's not a political book. It's really a character sketch of a great man, how he inspired and changed my life, and how I believe that his story still has the power to inspire and change still today. So how did it all begin? Well, I was always that nerdy little kid that loved presidents and politics and government, which may be normal if you grew up in Washington, D.C., but I grew up here in Southern California. And I was kind of that strange little kid. My parents didn't know quite what to do with me, pushed me out the door and said, "Go do whatever you're going to do, and good luck." I never imagined that an ordinary girl from Orange County would ever cross paths with such an extraordinary man, let alone have an opportunity to serve him in the way that I did. So I'm going to embarrass myself, but it's in the book, so it's already out there. I've had to get over the embarrassment of it. But I want to tell you what it was like to meet Ronald Reagan for the first time. Is there anybody in this audience who has met Ronald Reagan? I bet there's a few. Yeah. So for the rest of you, you're going to meet him the way I met him for the very first time. So I went into interview. It was very intimidating. My family wasn't politically connected. We weren't of the donor class or anything like that. But my dad taught me to believe that somebody's got to have the job you want, and it might as well be you. So I was a communications major at Pepperdine University. I took a chance. I wrote a letter to the office of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan had just left the White House, returned to Los Angeles, and I thought if I could work anywhere, I would work for that man. But what are the chances of that, right? But I took my dad's words to heart. I wrote a letter to the office, got called in for an interview, and really thought that it would just be an incredible experience just to step foot on the floor of that office. The interview, I thought, went pretty well, and at the end, here's what happened. So waiting for my interviewer in the lobby felt almost like a dream state. It was so foreign to anything I'd ever done or experienced, and yet somehow felt strangely familiar, as if this was all meant to be. The door nearest me suddenly swung open, and 4 Secret Service agents in suits and ties with earpieces, radios, and guns holstered under their coats walked hurriedly toward me. Did they know who I was? Did they know what I was doing there? Were they going to arrest me or shoot me? And then behind the lead agents, I saw 2 older gentlemen in golf attire. Wait, was it? Could it possibly be? It was President Ronald Reagan and his golf buddy for the day, Walter Annenberg. In all of my interview prep and planning, I don't know why it had never occurred to me that I might actually meet President Reagan. I kind of panicked and I didn't know what to do, so I thought about what I would do if the flag were passing by. So I stood up straight, placing my hand over my heart, not even looking at him, staring non-threateningly and nobly off into the distance. I'm certain I looked completely ridiculous. But instead of walking past me, true Ronald Reagan, he walked right toward me, looked me in the eye and extended his hand. I shook his hand and introduced myself. Well, hello, Peggy. It's nice to meet you, said the 40th President of the United States of America. I'd imagined him as a 10-foot-tall giant. After all, he had been a movie star, a governor, and president of the United States. He had tackled communism head-on, fixed the domestic economy, and solved many of the world's problems. And yet here he was, an ordinary man, just over 6 feet tall. His hair in pictures appeared jet black, but up close I saw touches of gray, evidence of his 78 years. He was ruddy and rosy-cheeked, full of life, happiness, and vitality. His smile was more asymmetrical than I had ever noticed in photographs, but it was perfect in its imperfect way. And those eyes, a wonderful, bright, true blue, carrying so much joy. He was gone as quickly as he appeared, taking all the people, the energy, and the aura of power and importance with him. The office was suddenly eerily still. Selena, the woman who had interviewed me, then walked through the same door, grinning ear to ear, having witnessed my ridiculous salute. It's pretty incredible meeting him for the first time, isn't it? You should have warned me, I said, still trembling inside. No, it's much better this way. And though I felt I had horribly embarrassed myself, I had to agree. She then handed me parking validation stickers and said, I was going to call you tomorrow and leave you hanging in suspense for at least a while, but I already know we want you to work with us. So can you start on Monday? Yes, I could. So I held it all together until I was outside the building. I didn't know whether to shout for joy, cry, or drop to my knees in prayers of thanksgiving. I was so overwhelmed by all that happened, I started laughing out loud, the preposterousness of it all. Me, him, this office, Fox Plaza, Avenue of the Stars. We had met, he shook my hand, and now I work for him? I had no idea what Monday would hold, but I knew with confidence that my life would never be the same after that day. And in fact, it had already changed. So now you got to meet him as I did. Hopefully you wouldn't have embarrassed yourself like I did, but it tended to work out okay. So I started working for him in 1989. He had just left the White House. He returned to Los Angeles. I was hired on the spot to work for what I just thought would be a short-term internship. At the end of my internship, I was hired to work full-time for the chief of staff as his executive assistant, and I served him for the next few years. Many of you may know Fred Ryan, who started Politico and is publisher of the Washington Post. I was his executive assistant for several years. And then Ronald Reagan's longtime executive assistant he had had since before he was governor retired. They asked me to take that job. So not something you say no to. But it was wonderful to see this man. My job ran the spectrum, everything from the sensational to the ordinary, interfacing with Buckingham Palace and the White House to making sure he had toothpaste in his bathroom if he wanted to brush his teeth, or cash in his pocket if he wanted to go get his hair cut. One of the things I loved about Ronald Reagan is there weren't 2 Ronald Reagans, and so the man you saw in public was the man he was in private. When the cameras weren't rolling, when he thought nobody was watching, that's when I watched and noticed everything he did. And the lessons he taught me in those quiet moments were the same ones that he taught the world on the global stage. You know, when I was looking back to write this book, it's surprising because you would think it would be all the black tie dinners and the sensational, really glitzy moments that would stand out. But surprisingly, when I went back to reflect on what it all really meant to me, I surprisingly looked back on the ordinary days, if you could call any day with a president ordinary, and how a little girl from Southern California winds up crossing paths with such an extraordinary man. And I looked back on those days when it was just a handful of us in the office, and those were the days that I really looked to as being very special. Those moments in the back of the car when it was just the two of us, Secret Service driving to an event. Those quiet moments were really the ones that I look back to, even more than the black tie affairs. Of course, I witnessed historic signatures. I got to completely spoiled me. We flew private aircraft everywhere. I'm in my 20s. I kind of curse that now every time I'm, jumping onto my commercial flight. But it was a wonderful, amazing experience. One of my favorite roles was actually being behind the lens of his camera. So in the White House, of course, he has a whole team of photographers, and post-presidency, whoever's around, which is usually was me, took the pictures. And so it's fun. In the book, I got to share a lot of never-before seen photos from his post-presidency years. And in fact, the cover photo was one that I snapped one day in his office. I walked into his office one day, and the lighting was coming in just perfectly, as if it was studio lit. And I said, "Mr. President, you look especially handsome today. Do you mind if I take your picture?" In his classic, "Well, all right." I went and grabbed my camera, snapped one photo back in the film days of camera, and never realizing that all these years later, it would wind up on the cover of a book. But I think it really captures him beautifully in those post-presidency years. The warmth, the welcome, as if he's sitting there waiting to see you now. Of course, there were sensational moments, black tie affairs, where here was Mrs. Reagan and Lady Margaret Thatcher before a black tie dinner. I also got to capture moments like this after our event. If you can tell, the ladies have their shoes off, they're in their stocking feet, and the president's kind of got his eyes rolled back like, "Stop talking so we can go home." I'm sure no men in this room can relate to that, but it was fun to catch these amazing people in these very normal moments. I learned as a young person what diplomacy really looks like. And diplomacy, Ronald Reagan's way, did not look like rhetoric. It looked like relationships. It didn't look political. It looked very personal. Post-presidency, nobody had to come visit him for protocol or diplomatic reasons. People came to see him because they wanted to. They had a relationship with him that they wanted to continue, that had started either in the presidency or even prior, that they wanted to continue. So people came from all over the world, people like Gorbachev, Chancellor Helmut Kohl from Germany, President-elect Walesa from Poland, Prime Minister and Mrs. Brian Mulroney from Canada, Prime Minister Nakasone from Japan, and even Mother Teresa, who's now a saint, came all the way from Calcutta, India. They had a relationship with this man that they wanted to continue. The other thing that struck me about diplomacy, as a young person, I thought you had to decide whether you were going to be a strong person and successful, or whether you're going to be a kind person. And the naivete of youth, I thought you had to pick one path or the other. And in Ronald Reagan, I found this beautiful blend of somebody who was, nobody argued was strong. He went toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union, told that man to tear that wall down, and he did. But couched in that was this beautiful humanity of a person who was warm and charming and welcoming and charismatic, and he completely changed my idea of what diplomacy at the highest level and leadership at the highest level really looks like. There was an authenticity about him which people loved. You knew exactly who you were dealing with. He didn't put on airs. I don't know if anybody's been up to the Reagan Ranch, but it's surprisingly very modest and humble. It's not a palatial presidential retreat. I see some head nodding, yes. It's a little adobe home that was built at the end of the 1800s, and he loved that place. And he loved it so much, he loved taking people up there. He would bring people like Lady Thatcher up there. I don't think she owned Rancho tire, so that was about as casual as she got. But he was unashamed to bring people up there. Who he was true through and through. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney came up there as well, a little more ready and dressed for the ranch, bouncing around in the back of a Secret Service beat-up old Suburban. And one of my favorite conversations I overheard was Mrs. Reagan talking to Mrs. Mulroney. And Mila Mulroney is this very beautiful, elegant, fashionable woman. And she looked at Mrs. Reagan and she said, "Well, Nancy, aren't you so stylish in your boot-cut jeans?" And Mrs. Reagan looked down and she said, "Oh, I've been wearing these since the last time these were in fashion." Can anybody relate? I know if you keep things in your closet long enough, they do come around. But there's nothing like seeing President Reagan behind the wheel of his Jeep. Here's a man who hadn't driven in 8 years, and so he kind of wanted to stay off the road when he was driving, but he is behind the wheel of the Jeep here. He looks like a little kid, very excited. That's actually Gorbachev riding shotgun with him, and a very nervous Secret Serviceman in the back, along with the interpreter. But it was fun to see them in these authentic, unguarded moments. And I write extensively in my book about one of my little assignments where President Reagan had asked me if I would go find a cowboy hat to give to Gorbachev when he came to the ranch. So, of course, I said, "Mr. President, I'd be happy to do that," not realizing what was entailed. So how exactly do you figure out what size cowboy hat Gorbachev wears? Because if you know anything about cowboy hats, if it's too small, it's going to perch too high. And if it's too big, it's going to perch too low. And I knew that global cameras would be watching. And so this was before the day, actually, of email. I'm dating myself here. So I would wait until 10 o'clock at night to call Moscow at 8 o'clock in the morning and tried to find somebody who spoke enough English. And I sent faxes with crude drawings and arrows and question marks, trying to find this cowboy hat size. So finally I get back a number and I realize, well, that's not a hat size. But I think, gosh, if I could convert that Russian hat size into a Western hat size, now maybe we're getting someplace. Of course, the final piece was trying to find a cowboy hat in Los Angeles, which is a challenge in and of itself. But as you can see, the day we presented it to Gorbachev, the hat fit perfectly. I was very proud of myself, kind of patting myself on the back, until the next day Stetson called and said, "We so appreciate you featuring so prominently our hat. But did you realize that Gorbachev put the hat on backwards?" I'm not a cowgirl, I don't know these things, but the best laid plans sometimes don't always work out. Ronald Reagan was a man of incredible gratitude. Here's a man who had received everything, done everything, gone everywhere, always won the trophy and the prize and the gold sticker and the star, right? Here he is receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And what I loved about that is on the way home, here we are on the plane on the flight home. It's a long flight from DC to LA, so of course he had taken his coat off, but he left that medal on and he wore it all the way home. Out of all the honors he had received, that meant something to him. It meant so much to him to have had the opportunity to serve as president. And I love this photo because it just symbolizes the fact that it truly meant something. It didn't get handed off and go put this in my library. He wore that all the way home. The other thing about this photo, if you look, what is he doing? Writing his thank you notes. By the way, he had a woman who'd been happy to write those notes for him tomorrow. But here was a man who lived such a life of gratitude. He put pen to paper and said what he wanted to say, how he wanted to say it, right then. And as much as I love this photo that I snapped that day, it kind of curses me because I travel a lot. And so every time I get on a plane, instead of queuing up a movie or a book or taking a nap, because of this picture, what do you think I do? I pull out my thank you notes and I sit there and write them, because if this man can do it, I certainly can do it. What a great model he was of discipline. He didn't know I was watching, and yet he changed my life. One of my favorite things I received over the years, you can imagine, I received some incredible gifts. This is the woman who sat outside the president's door. In fact, my kids were digging through my jewelry. I'm a mother of 4. I have a son and 3 daughters, and actually my son just got married, so I'm a proud mother-in-law as well with a daughter-in-law. But my daughters were digging through my jewelry box the other day, and they go, "Mom, you have a gold watch from the King of Jordan." And I said, "Oh, I do?" I mean, just so many things over the years kind of have filtered by. What I will never forget is one simple piece of paper that President Reagan gave me one year for Christmas, and this is it. He was known to be a doodler, and he made a doodle for me. It's a cowboy. I like to think maybe it's a self-portrait of Ronald Reagan, and it says, "Merry Christmas to Peggy, Nancy, and Ronald Reagan." And what I love about this is when he gave it to me for Christmas, he was a little apologetic and he said, Peggy, I really wanted to do something special for you and I didn't know what I could do for you without involving you because you know you do all my shopping. And so here was a man who took the time and the thoughtfulness and had the gratitude to do something so special, and there's nothing over the years that I received that I would treasure more than this. He was a man who lived an immense life of gratitude. The world knew him for so many things. I knew him as a man of incredible kindness. This looks like a prom picture, but it's actually when I told him I had gotten engaged to my husband, Greg. We just celebrated our 28th wedding anniversary. And he was also there when I got married and had 3 of my 4 kids while I worked for him. So he was a very patient man. He was there to welcome my first, which was my son, Taylor, and my second, which is my daughter, Courtney, my third, which is my daughter, Paige, and my fourth, my daughter, Jocelyn, at which point Mrs. Reagan literally grabbed me by the arm one day, dragged me out to the hallway, and she said, Peggy, you know how this is happening, right? Not really a conversation I want to have with the former First Lady or anybody, but for and no more. And how wonderful it was for my kids to grow up with the President and Mrs. Reagan, to be welcomed in their home, to swim in their pool. One of my favorite memories is walking through the Los Angeles Zoo, seeing Ronald Reagan push my son in his stroller, flanked by United States Secret Service. I mean, pretty crazy years growing up with them. But what I love about that is that kids don't care who you are. They don't care if you're important or if you have money or what you did or what your title is. They know one thing. Do you like me? Do you care about me? Do you have fun when I'm around? And my kids grew up knowing that President and Mrs. Reagan loved and adored them and felt very welcome by them. I have taught my son better manners. He wanted to jump up on the president's desk because he wanted to give the president a real hug, not a leg hug, because you know when they're 3, they like hug your knees. So he jumped up on the president's desk to give him a hug, and the president, of course, was very gracious, but we spent lots of birthdays and Halloween and Christmas and all kinds of incredible moments with the President and Mrs. Reagan. For my kids, it was all very normal. In the evening, I'd be dressed up, and my son would look at me and he'd say, Mommy, are you having dinner tonight with Daddy or the president? All very normal for them. My husband actually had a lot of fun as well, because as the president's friends got older, a lot of them were unable to play golf, and Ronald Reagan continued to play golf well into his post-presidency. So every now and then on Friday afternoon, the phone would ring, and it was Mrs. Reagan asking if Greg could be the 4th for Ronnie's golf game. Of course, he would say yes, and then he would turn to me and he'd say, honey, you know, I was really looking forward to that honey-do list of chores on Saturday. I couldn't wait to get started, but duty calls. I must serve my country. I must go play golf with the president. So of course I let him do that, and did what every good wife would do. I hired a gardener and a handyman so that we've stayed happily married. But it was funny because he would come back with stories from the golf course, and I would kind of look and say, the president said that to you? Because there was always this awareness, I guess, on his point of when women were in the room. And he would never have told anything that he thought was even the slightest bit off color or inappropriate in front of a woman. And so my husband would come home with a whole new repertoire of jokes that I had not heard in the office, but really enjoyed some incredible time out on the golf course with the president. I don't know if you know Ronald Reagan's life story. We think of him on the world stage, but really he came from very humble beginnings. In fact, next week will mark what would have been his 108th birthday. He was born February 6, 1911, little tiny wide spot in the middle of the road in central Illinois. His father was an alcoholic. His family was very poor, and if you looked at the deck of cards he had been dealt with his life, you would have said, that poor kid, he'll never have a chance. He will never amount to anything. But fortunately for us, he was raised by a woman who was an incredible woman of faith and patriotism and optimism. And she raised him to believe that God has a plan for everyone, and seemingly random twists of fate are all part of his plan. And in the end, everything will work out for the best. And how grateful we are for his mother's investment. She really made all the difference, taking this little boy from such difficult circumstances and raising him to be the man that he was. We, of course, remember him as the great communicator, but I think we also remember him, those of us in the room who remember the 1980s and the 1970s, we remember him as the great optimist, don't we? There's a few people who remember the 1970s, and if you recall, taxes were high, inflation was high, unemployment was high. And worst of all, American morale was incredibly low. But Ronald Reagan took office, and on day one, he completely changed the narrative. He began using different language, and he said, "It's morning in America. There's a new dawn ahead. America's best days are yet ahead. There's a shining city on the hill, and we all get to be part of it together." And if you look at the things that he did during the 1980s and what he was most proud of at the end of his presidency, it wasn't about anything he had done. He said, "I made the American people believe in themselves again." He was a great optimist. He painted a different picture for what we could do and become together. And we did great things together in the 1980s, due in part to a lot of his optimism. You know, in so many ways, I feel like I actually grew up with Ronald Reagan, and he taught me everything I will ever need to know about how to live and how to lead. And the lasting image he left me with is that your legacy is not something that's written after you're gone. It's something that's written with every single day of your life. We're not still talking about Ronald Reagan all these years later because he's gone. We're talking about him all of these years later because of how he lived his life. And what a great reminder to all of us that we should lead and live as if our legacy depends upon it, because it does. You know, his legacy was being written with every single day of his life, and having a front row seat to the writing of that legacy changed me forever. This picture I love, we were walking out of a political rally, and as we were walking out, I was in front of him, and I heard this roar of the crowd behind me, and I had, of course, the camera around my neck, and I heard this roar, and I turned around, and I snapped this photo, and I think it so brilliantly captures the desire people had to connect with him, to reach out to him, to just be close to him. What an incredible man. Over the course of 10 years that I worked for him, there's of course so many moments that stand out in my mind, but I wanted to share just a few today that I think express exactly how he was writing the legacy of his life, times when nobody was watching except for me. There was one day a little boy, and he had Asperger's syndrome, came into the office, and it's a form of autism, and his family had written into the office and said that this little boy loved Ronald Reagan, had read everything and memorized every fact about Ronald Reagan, and would love a chance to meet this man. And so, of course, we invited them in, and this little boy stood there and kind of looking way up at the president was sort of telling him about his life and asking him about his life and kind of quizzing him, but then sometimes actually correcting the president when he thought that the president got the answer wrong to the question. And watching this beautiful exchange between this little boy with Asperger's and this former world leader, Ronald Reagan was writing the legacy of his life in interactions like that. There was also a time when his former Secret Service agent, who had stood post outside the president's bedroom window every day for 8 years but had never met him more than just a quick receiving line, wrote in and said he was retiring and asked if he could come in, and of course the president gladly brought him in. And he said to the president, "Mr. President, I loved standing outside your bedroom window every night because I knew if you could sleep, then you would be rested and could make decisions for the rest of us the next day. I felt that was so important, and I loved my job, and I loved serving you in that way." And to watch the president show his appreciation to that man who had devoted so many years of his life to his protection. Ronald Reagan was writing the legacy of his life. There was another moment when there was a war hero, and this man had been shot down behind enemy lines. He had survived for nearly a week by eating bugs and leaves until he was rescued. Ronald Reagan read about this man and invited him into the office and presented him with a special award and wanted to express his gratitude to him. And at the end of this meeting, it was this beautiful moment as they were saying goodbye. And this young man stood in front of the president's desk and he said, "Mr. President, I know you're no longer my commander-in-chief, but I feel like I would like to salute you. Would that be okay?" And President Reagan looked at him and said, "I know I'm no longer your commander-in-chief either, but I'd like to salute you back, if that's all right." And so these two men stood facing each other, saluting each other. One had so much of life ahead of him, one had so much of life behind him, showing this beautiful respect to each other in that moment. Ronald Reagan was writing the legacy of his life with every day of his life. Over the course of 10 years, it wasn't even close. There was one moment that stands out in my mind so vividly. There was this day that this little tiny Romanian woman had written into the office. She walked in the office. She was very elderly, very stooped with age, with years, with a very difficult life. She walked into President Reagan's office and she took one look at him, and she dropped to his feet, and she started sobbing and kissing this man's feet. And as I watched this, and the president watched this, and the president reached down and brought her up to stand, she looked at him with tears streaming down her face, and she thanked him for bringing freedom to her and to her family and to her people. Somehow this little woman from Romania had traced the dots of her freedom back to this man's feet. And as I watched this, I thought of all the people around the world, if they had had the same opportunity to meet Ronald Reagan in person, would have also dropped to his feet and thanked him for the most important gift of all, which was freedom. You know, we saw when President Reagan passed away the outpouring of affection and respect from across the nation and around the world. People stopped everything they were doing. They waited in line for hours to walk past his flag-draped casket. They went out of their way to line the streets, to wave flags, to bring flowers, to make signs. Their world stopped so they could pay tribute to this man. What was so remarkable about this is most of these people had never even met Ronald Reagan personally, and yet somehow felt connected to him. They had been impacted by his life. They felt like he mattered to them. And I think it's because they knew that they always mattered to him. Ronald Reagan had a wonderful way of speaking in such a large way, and yet coming through the lens of the camera into your own living room, and you felt like he was talking just to you. Here's a man who cared about the world, cared, of course, about our nation, but truly cared about individuals. And we saw the outpouring when he passed away of that. You know, there's so many things I think we loved and appreciated about President Reagan, but I honestly believe that one of the reasons that we look back on those years is with such fondness is that we loved President Reagan because we loved ourselves, and we loved who we were on the world stage when he was president. We were bold in shining the torch of freedom all over the world. We were clear in communicating an optimistic vision for the future. And one of my favorite quotes about Ronald Reagan, and I think it kind of symbolizes so beautifully what he represented and what he meant to us. It was one of his final public speeches. It was in 1992 at the Houston convention of the RNC, and one of his final public addresses. And I'm going to paraphrase, but he in essence says, "Whatever else history may say about me when I'm gone, let it reflect that I appealed to your best hopes and to your fondest dreams, not to your doubts and to your fears." And I think so much of politics today is full of fear and full of doubt, and we need to get back to being optimistic, thinking of our fondest dreams and our biggest hopes. So I'm going to I probably have time for one or two questions, and then I want to close with a passage from the book. So does anybody have a question? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if he was ever one to speak out against things, but he would definitely speak in favor of things. And so he had this beautiful way of always taking even something that was a difficult conversation to have or negative and turning it into a positive. And so rather than being critical, I would guess that Ronald Reagan would probably paint a beautiful picture of maybe a better way that we could communicate and interact. And, you know, I kind of feel like, too, if Ronald Reagan was around, it's sort of like having your parents in the room. You sort of sit up straight and you're on your best behavior, and you maybe don't use such crass language because he's there. So I just think our political landscape would be so much different if Ronald Reagan was still around, and I think he lingers still in so many people today. Yeah?
Which president was he closest to post-presidency?
Post-presidency, well, George Bush, obviously, who was his vice president, came in. I do a lot of writing, actually, for Fox News. I do a lot of opinion pieces for them, and I recently wrote one about President Bush when he passed away. And I'll share a quick little story because I love it, how it just shows their relationship. So post-presidency, George Bush, 41, came in to see President Reagan in the office, and he was the sitting president of the United States at the time. So he comes in with the whole entourage and Secret Service and the motorcade and all of the trappings and pomp and circumstance of being president. And he walks into President Reagan's office and he bounds through the door and he says, "Where's my president?" And I loved that because here's the sitting president of the United States who still refers to Ronald Reagan as his president. And so they had a beautiful relationship. He actually saw the office of the presidency as being something that was very important and bigger and more established than any one person. And so he really didn't look to the partisanship of that. He really looked to the importance of that office, and I think embodied beautifully how that office can be lived out. Yeah. Yeah. Periodically, I definitely, sent them a copy of my book. I wanted them to be comfortable with it and know about it. Family dynamics are tough. I'm a mother of 4. I can tell you that the tougher job of being EA to the president and being a mother of 4, that's definitely the more difficult job. And so, it's tough being in the public eye, and so I just pretty much choose not to comment on that. Most of the kids have written a lot about their parents, and so I'll let their words stand for themselves. But it's complicated and complex, as anybody who's a parent knows. Yeah. Yeah, so I write in the book, obviously, about it. You can't talk about those post-presidency years without talking about it. Again, I tried to find that beautiful line between being revealing and also being respectful. I don't think there's anything that you're going to read that you think, oh, I didn't really want to know that. But for anybody who certainly has dealt with it in their family, you'll be able to connect the dots of it. That was his story to tell, and so I tell it from my perspective. It was a difficult time, but I look at President and Mrs. Reagan and how grateful we are for their willingness to take something that was very painful and private and to go public with it, because think of all the people who have been helped by that and all the research dollars that have gone to it. And I know when he received the first diagnosis, I didn't know anything about Alzheimer's, and I found, I think, one book that kind of talked about senility and dementia in the library, and really that was it. So there was so much that was unknown, and now there's volumes of information, and of course we're hopeful that there will eventually be a cure, but I admired them for going public with something that was very personal and very difficult, and I think that they've helped a lot of families by being willing to share their story. Maybe one more question, and then I'll close with a passage from the book. Or if not, okay. Has anybody been up to the Reagan Library? Probably a few people. All right. So I thought I'd close with a passage from the book that talks about what it was like to go to the Reagan Library with Ronald Reagan himself. So one particular visitor who loved going up to the library time and time again was Ronald Reagan himself. Whether it was to showcase this beautiful historic facility to a friend or a head of state, or to open a new exhibit, there was nothing like walking through the museum exhibits with the president and seeing how people would respond to seeing him there. They had come to learn about him, never imagining they would ever meet him. It was a little like that movie Night at the Museum for some of the guests there, where history literally came to life. People responded in 2 distinct ways when they saw him. The first group, as I had done, took a step back, as if seeing him from a distance was enough, or perhaps too much. The second group made a beeline for him, which drew a quick response from the Secret Service, putting their hand out to shake his. It was as if they had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times and were fully prepared when their chance meeting occurred. There wasn't much in between, an interesting, though unscientific observation of mine. Kids, I noticed, usually fell into the second category, bold and unafraid to approach him. They loved him, and he loved nothing more than being surrounded by a giggling group of school kids at his library. I usually had to pull him along to keep him on schedule. The kids would boo me, but the president would just laugh and point to me saying, "She's telling me I need to go now. I better do what she says." One time we were getting ready to leave the library, and the sky was especially clear, and the sun was beginning to set. We saw a distant glimmer of the ocean in the distance, and it felt as if we were on top of the world and could see forever, atop a steep slope, down to distant houses and fields. The president paused for a moment, and as we stood silently side by side, he looked over his left shoulder at his future memorial site, which was poorly disguised behind a few low hedges, the place where he and Mrs. Reagan would eventually be buried. He squared his body so that his angle perfectly matched that of the burial site, and he turned to me and he said, "I think I'll enjoy this view." He laughed to diffuse an otherwise very awkward moment. And in spite of making me smile on the outside, just the thought of the day when we would lay him to rest there pained me deeply. He, however, seemed unaffected by the joke, comfortable to the core in who he was and in the remarkable life he had been given. I savored this quiet, peaceful moment and lingered extra long that day to enjoy the incredible view, both the beautiful landscape in front of me and the iconic profile to my left, lit beautifully with the warm glow of the setting California sun. Thank you so much for having me here today.